The cold in a polished marble was the first thing he felt, a brutal shock against his cheekbone. On your knees. Now. The command cracked through the cavernous lobby, sharp and serrated. You picked the wrong building to play dress-up in tonight. Boy. 3 officers converged on him, a cage of blue uniforms and aggression. Before he could even process the order, a knee ground into his spine, driving the air from his lungs as his face was slammed against the floor. The lobby's bright, indifferent lights glinted off the expensive watch on his wrist. I have identification, the man managed, his voice strained but steady. Shut it, the lead officer growled, his voice thick with contempt. Hands where I can see them. You think that suit and watch make you one of them? Your kind doesn't belong here. A sneer spread across the officer's face, anticipating a driver's license. An excuse. A lie. With agonizing slowness, they allowed him to reach inside his tailored jacket. But it wasn't a wallet he produced. First came the ID case, flipped open to reveal not just a driver's license, but the unmistakable, heavy golden shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm Special Agent in Charge Marcus Coleman, he said, his voice now devoid of any strain, replaced by a cold, lethal authority. He let the weight of that title settle in the suddenly silent air. Then, he delivered the final blow. This is my operation, and every single one of you is on camera. The blood drained from the officers' faces, the sneers and aggression evaporating into a cloud of pure, sickening dread. In that moment, the look in Marcus Coleman's eyes wasn't one of anger or humiliation. It was a promise of methodical, systemic consequences that would shake their entire department to its very foundation. This happened in a Chicago high-rise, but it could have happened anywhere. What's the reality like where you live? Let us know what state you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe accountability matters, make sure you like this story, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more content that holds power to account. The chilled, recycled air of the Atlas Financial Tower lobby tasted of ammonia-based polish and the dry paper and leather scent of old money. To Marcus Coleman, it was a familiar flavor, a sterile perfume for a world built on pristine, reflective surfaces that often concealed deep, structural fractures. He moved across the cavernous space with a purpose that was both practiced and innate, a controlled, fluid gait that radiated confidence without broadcasting intent. His eyes, calm but constantly in motion, performed a silent, sweeping inventory of the environment, logging data with the dispassionate precision of a machine. Every detail was captured, analyzed, and filed away. The security desk was the first and most obvious feature, a hulking monolith of veined marble clearly designed for aesthetic presence rather than tactical advantage. From its central position, it offered a commanding view of the main entrance. Yet its very grandness created significant blind spots near the frosted glass entrances to the elevator banks. Behind the desk, a young guard sat bathed in the blue glow of a smartphone, his posture slumped, his attention utterly captured by the device. The guard barely registered the entrance of a man in a perfectly tailored suit. First point of failure, Marcus thought, the observation triggering a familiar flicker of professional disappointment that momentarily mixed with the cold, sharp focus of the mission. Complacency. It is the greatest and most reliable accomplice to any crime. As FBI Special Agent in Charge, Marcus Coleman had arrived at the Atlas Financial Tower to conduct this preliminary reconnaissance for a sprawling white-collar crime investigation, one that had the potential to unravel a significant portion of the city's financial elite. For this initial phase, anonymity was his greatest asset, operating entirely undercover, with no visible FBI identifiers. The agent's objective was to assess security protocols, map camera positions, and identify structural access points for the tactical operation to come. A subtle tilt of his head brought the ceiling into focus. His gaze traced the faint, smoked plastic domes of the surveillance cameras, a standard Pelco series, most likely running on a closed-circuit system that recorded to a server located somewhere in the building's core. 4 cameras were visible in the lobby alone, but what was more important were the angles they couldn't cover. Coleman's mind painted a 3-dimensional map of their intersecting fields of vision, immediately identifying a 12-foot dead zone along the western wall. Making a subtle motion with his phone, as if checking a message, he activated the device's camera. A series of high-resolution, near-silent captures documented the blind spot for later analysis by his team. From there, the agent moved to the building directory, a gleaming brass and glass affair that listed the tower's prestigious tenants. His primary targets, Westfield Holdings, Atlas Investment Partners, and Meridian Trust, occupied the 14th and 15th floors. The penthouse levels. It was entirely predictable. Hubris was a remarkably consistent character flaw among the financial criminals he hunted. They always craved the top floor, the corner office, the panoramic view, a physical testament to their perceived dominance over the world below. That very isolation, however, made them easier to contain. As he recorded the details, a prickling sensation crawled up the back of his neck. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He didn't turn or adjust his posture. The agent simply continued his task, his senses expanding to encompass the space behind him. This wasn't the casual, unfocused gaze of a passerby, nor was it coming from the distracted guard at the front desk. This was a focused, intense, and deeply analytical scrutiny. It emanated from the security office, its tinted windows a dark, inscrutable eye he had clocked on his way in. His professional and methodical behavior was being observed on security monitors by Kevin Barrett, a guard who considered himself a sentinel. Inside that cramped office, Barrett leaned forward, his worn-out chair groaning in protest. He'd been a security guard for 20 years, and in that time, he'd cultivated what he proudly called a gut feeling for trouble, an instinct he believed was more reliable than any camera or motion detector. Barrett watched the man on the monitor, a knot of suspicion tightening in his stomach. The suit was expensive, sharp, and perfectly tailored. The watch that flashed on the man's wrist was a Patek Philippe, or a damn good replica that cost more than Barrett's car. The man carried himself with an easy authority, like he owned the place. And that was precisely the problem. Barrett knew the men who ran this place, and this individual wasn't one of them. The wrong face, the wrong color, the wrong everything. He's too calm, Barrett thought, his thick fingers drumming an agitated rhythm on the console. Too interested in that directory. Honest people just find their company and go. They don't linger. This man wasn't just looking, he was studying, analyzing, cataloging. With a flick of the joystick, the camera zoomed in, the image of the man's face filling the screen. Strong features, a clean-shaven head that gleamed under the lobby's spotlights, eyes that were constantly moving, taking in everything. The build was athletic, solid, not the soft physique of the executives Barrett saw every day. Definitely not one of Westfield's guys, Barrett muttered to himself, the sound a low growl in the quiet room. The conviction hardened in his mind, his gut feeling crystallizing into what he perceived as fact. The expensive attire was just a costume, a clever disguise meant to bypass the building's natural defenses. Kevin Barrett, seeing a black man in a suit taking notes, a man who didn't fit the narrow profile of who he thought belonged in this temple of finance, immediately deemed him suspicious and, with a sense of righteous certainty, reached for the phone. He decided to report him. The certainty of his biased conviction sent a jolt of adrenaline through Kevin Barrett, and as his fingers stabbed at the numbers on his phone, he set in motion a sequence of events whose consequences he could never have predicted. His voice was low and urgent as he spoke into the phone's receiver, his eyes still glued to the security monitor where the man in the suit had just entered an elevator. Dispatch, this is Atlas Financial Security. I have a 1036 suspicious individual casing the upper floors. He used the police code for suspicious person deliberately. It made his gut feeling sound like a professional assessment. It gave his prejudice the weight of a fact. Copy that. Atlas, Can you provide a description? The dispatcher's voice crackled back, bored and procedural. Male, black, maybe 6'1", Barrett said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Wearing a suit that's trying too hard. You know, too clean. He's been wandering around, taking pictures of security infrastructure with his phone. This was a lie, a crucial embellishment. The man had taken notes, but Barrett knew taking pictures sounded more premeditated, more criminal. I think he's prepping for a B&E. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, a moment of consideration. Has he threatened anyone? Is he armed? The dispatcher asked, her tone sharpening slightly. Negative. No visible weapon. No threats. Barrett conceded, a hint of frustration in his voice. He needed them to understand the feeling of the threat, not just the facts. But the behavior is off. He's evasive. He doesn't belong here. Our tenants are high-profile financial firms. We can't take chances with this type of individual. He stressed the last words, letting the coded language do its work. High profile meant wealthy and implicitly white. This type of individual meant the opposite. Kevin Barrett's call, a blend of half-truths and fully formed prejudice, was all it took. Within minutes, 3 Chicago police patrol cars, their lights off, were gliding silently through the evening traffic. Converging on the gleaming glass tower, the officers inside had been given the report, a potential burglar, casing a high-security financial building, description matching a black male. In their minds, a narrative was already taking shape. They were converging on a man who remained completely unaware that he had been racially profiled. At that moment, Marcus Coleman stepped out onto the 14th floor. The air was still, cooled to a precise 68 degrees. The only sound the faint, almost subliminal hum of enterprise-grade servers from behind the locked office doors of Westfield Holdings. This was the nerve center of the operation, the heart of the beast. He continued his methodical assessment, his experienced eyes noting the positions of passive infrared motion detectors near the ceiling corners and the specific model of Schlage electronic locks on the doors. A quiet murmur escaped his lips as he dictated encrypted voice notes into his phone. Main office suite uses a keycard and biometric scanner, likely a fingerprint reader. Older model. Defeating it will require a bypass, not a brute force attack. He moved down the plushly carpeted hallway, the thick pile absorbing the sound of his footsteps, making him a ghost in the silent machine. As he rounded a corner near the elevator bank, he froze. 3 of them. They had emerged from the fire stairwell with the silent, coordinated efficiency of a predator team. They weren't just standing there. They were positioned. One officer stood directly in his path, feet planted shoulder-width apart. Another was several feet to the left, slightly back, creating an overlapping field of fire. The third was already moving to his right, a smooth, practiced motion to cut off any retreat to the stairwell. The lead officer, a man in his mid-40s with a rigid crew cut and a jawline tight with preemptive judgment, took a half-step forward, his hand already resting near the butt of his holstered sidearm. His eyes were cold, flat, and held no trace of inquiry, only confirmation. Police, stop right there. The command was absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. The officer, led by the man whose nameplate read R. Tanner, intercepted Marcus Coleman, immediately positioning themselves in a textbook confrontational stance. Marcus's federal training took over instantly, a calm, cold wave washing over the initial surge of adrenaline. His mind processed the scene not as a civilian would, but as a tactician. He saw their positions, their posture, their hands, an L-shaped ambush. It was aggressive, profoundly excessive for confronting a single, unarmed man in a business suit. Slowly, deliberately. He raised his hands to chest level, keeping his palms open and visible, a universal sign of non-aggression designed to de-escalate. Marcus Coleman remained calm and professional, his body language controlled, his face a neutral mask. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice perfectly level, a measured baritone that absorbed the tension in the air rather than adding to it. His gaze met Rick Tanner's directly. Is there a problem? Officer Tanner's eyes narrowed, performing a slow, deliberate sweep of Marcus's body, a visual pat-down meant to intimidate and assert dominance. That's what we're here to find out, Tanner said, his voice a low growl. Building security reported suspicious activity. Suspicious? Marcus repeated, his tone unchanged. I can assure you my activity has been perfectly mundane. A smirk played at the edge of Tanner's lips, a quick, unpleasant twitch. Mundane. Wandering restricted floors after hours. Taking notes on your phone? That's not what I call mundane. What's your business here? I'm conducting a property assessment, Marcus stated, the deliberately vague but entirely truthful answer he had prepared for just such a possibility. Revealing his status now would detonate weeks of painstaking work. As if on cue, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Kevin Barrett stepped out, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and self-importance. He had followed them up, unable to resist seeing the resolution of the threat he had identified. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Marcus. That's him. That's the guy. The arrival of the civilian witness was all the reinforcement Rick Tanner needed. It validated his aggression. The smirk on his face widened into a triumphant sneer. It was all the justification he required to proceed. ID, he barked, the word sharp and percussive in the quiet hallway. As he spoke, his hand moved from the butt of his pistol to the retention strap on his holster, unsnapping it with an audible click. Now! This was a clear, unambiguous escalation, a signal that the situation had crossed a threshold from inquiry to potential violence. Marcus's focus narrowed, his breathing controlled. Of course, he said, his voice still a rock of calm in the churning water. I'm just going to reach into the inside pocket of my jacket for my wallet. Slowly. You do that, Tanner said, his voice laced with a dangerous, scraping edge, a sound that promised consequences for any sudden moves. You do that real slow. With 3 guns ready to be drawn at the slightest provocation, Marcus Coleman understood that the next few seconds were the most dangerous, a precarious moment where his survival depended entirely on the absolute control of his own movements. Every nerve ending was alight, every sensory input magnified. The scent of Officer Tanner's stale coffee, the almost imperceptible hum of the overhead fluorescent lights, the faint tremor in the junior officer's hand. All of it was data. He moved with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, a clear and non-threatening pantomime for the benefit of 3 men whose adrenaline and prejudice had already pushed them to the brink. His left hand rose, fingers spread, while his right hand drifted with painstaking precision toward the inside of his suit jacket. He carefully extracted his wallet. It was a simple, unadorned piece of black leather, thin and elegant. Inside and by design, his FBI credentials and the heavy, gold-plated federal badge were positioned in a clear plastic sleeve, directly behind the sleeve holding his state driver's license. It was a configuration designed for rapid, unambiguous identification, impossible for any competent officer to miss. With the wallet held between his thumb and forefinger, he offered it to Tanner. The officer, eschewing all protocol, snatched it from his hand with a roughness intended to convey contempt. Tanner flipped it open. For a fraction of a second, the light caught the raised eagle and the bold letters of the shield. A flicker of something, confusion, maybe even a jolt of alarm, registered in Tanner's eyes. It was an involuntary reaction, a moment of cognitive dissonance where the image he was seeing violently conflicted with the narrative he had constructed. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, instantly and willfully suppressed, buried under the concrete certainty of his initial judgment. Rick Tanner examined Marcus Coleman's driver's license, but deliberately ignored the federal credentials that were glaringly visible behind it. In a calculated act of theater, designed as much for his fellow officers as for himself, he used the tip of his thumb to slide out only the driver's license. With a flick of his wrist, he let the wallet fall shut on the federal credentials, dismissing the symbol of national authority as if it were an irrelevant coupon. This single, decisive action was a declaration. He would see only what he wanted to see. "Marcus Coleman," Tanner announced, his voice dripping with condescending familiarity. He held the license up, angling it to read the address. "And what kind of property assessment involves photographing access points and security cameras? Mr. Coleman?" The lie, started by Barrett, was now being laundered into an official police inquiry, a flimsy pretext for the harassment that was to follow. "The thorough kind," Marcus replied calmly, his voice a low, steady anchor. His gaze remained locked on Tanner, but his peripheral vision tracked the other two officers. They were relaxing slightly, their posture shifting now that their leader had established a narrative they understood. The man was a civilian, a suspect. The world was back in its proper order. The journey down to the lobby was a silent, suffocating ordeal. The four men stood in the cramped elevator, the air thick with unspoken hostility. Marcus stared at the brushed steel of the doors, his reflection a calm, impassive mask. He could feel their eyes on him, a palpable weight of judgment and suspicion. This wasn't a simple escort, it was a parade, a deliberate, calculated move to take the confrontation from the private isolation of the 14th floor to the public stage of the main lobby. The officers and Kevin Barrett publicly escorted Marcus Coleman to the main lobby, creating a spectacle for the remaining employees. When the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, every head in the vast, marble expanse turned. A handful of late working professionals, mostly white, paused their conversations, their gazes drawn to the scene unfolding. The sight of a distinguished black man in a tailored suit being flanked by 3 uniformed police officers was a piece of social theater so potent, so charged with preconceived meaning, that it demanded an audience. Kevin Barrett, his moment finally arrived, swelled with a sense of vindication. This was his building, and he had protected it. He was the hero of this story. "It's all right, folks. Everything is under control," he announced, his voice booming across the polished marble, startling a paralegal who was packing her briefcase. "We had a security threat, but it's been neutralized. Nothing to worry about." The subtext was thick and suffocating. "See? This is what a threat looks like. This is what we protect you from." From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw the smartphones emerge from pockets and purses, their small red recording lights winking on like malevolent fireflies. He subtly shifted his position, turning his body slightly to ensure his face was clearly illuminated by the brilliant overhead lights, his expression a carefully maintained mask of calm neutrality. Let them record. Documentation was a powerful weapon, and it was a weapon he intended to wield himself. "Stand here," Tanner commanded, his voice sharp, pointing to a spot on the floor directly under the brightest bank of lights. It was a placement that maximized visibility, turning a security procedure into a public pillory. "Empty your pockets, everything on the security desk. Now." "Is this standard procedure for someone who has not been charged with a crime?" "Officer Tanner?" Marcus asked. His voice wasn't raised, but it was pitched to carry, each word articulated with a cold, clear precision intended as much for the recording phones as for the officer. It was a question that hung in the air, a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the entire spectacle. Tanner's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. The suspect was questioning his authority, using the language of procedure against him. "Are you a lawyer now?" the officer snapped, his voice tight with anger. "Or are you going to comply with a lawful order?" "I am complying," Marcus said, the picture of placid cooperation. He began to methodically place his belongings on the cold marble of the security desk. He placed each item with a quiet deliberation that seemed to amplify the tension, a stark contrast to the aggressive chaos of the officer's actions. First, the wallet, then his keys, their metallic jingle echoing in the hushed lobby. Next, his encrypted phone, screen down, and finally on the small, black moleskin notebook. Marcus Coleman's professional notebook containing building observations was presented by Rick Tanner as if it were a smoking gun. Tanner snatched the notebook from the desk, his movements jerky and triumphant. Well, what do we have here?" he said, turning to the other officers but projecting his voice for the entire lobby to hear. He held the notebook up like a trophy, flipping through the pages filled with Marcus's neat, precise handwriting. Floor plans, security camera blind spots, notes on after-hours personnel. He looked up, a sneer twisting his features. "Looks like a pre-op for a heist to me." "Those are professional observations regarding security vulnerabilities," Marcus responded calmly, his gaze unwavering. "Something your friend Mr. Barrett might find useful if he were ever interested in actually improving his building's security." The subtle jab found its mark. Barrett, standing nearby, puffed out his chest, his face a mask of indignation. "My protocols are just fine," he blustered, his voice a little too loud. "They caught you, didn't they?" A heavy silence fell. Marcus held Barrett's gaze for a long moment before his eyes swept across the watching, judging faces of the crowd. He looked at the two black women near the entrance, their expressions a heartbreaking mixture of anger, fear, and a deep, weary resignation. They had seen this play before. They knew how it ended. Finally, his eyes returned to Barrett. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice quiet but resonant, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into the silent lobby. "They certainly did." The final, ironic words hung in the air of the lobby, their true meaning lost on everyone but the man who spoke them, as the officers, with a final surge of performative authority, guided Marcus Coleman through the revolving glass doors and into the anonymity of the night. The doors spun behind them, sealing off the world of marble floors and hushed judgment, and depositing them onto the concrete sidewalk. The cool night air, carrying the distant sounds of city traffic and the faint smell of street food, was a stark contrast to the sterile, superheated humiliation of the lobby. The audience was gone. The only remaining witness was the unblinking red light of a single security camera mounted on the building's facade. With the public performance over, the thin veneer of Officer Rick Tanner's professionalism evaporated completely, revealing the raw, undisguised prejudice beneath. He took a half step forward, deliberately planting himself in Marcus's personal space, a classic act of physical intimidation. His voice, now stripped of its authoritative boom, dropped to a low, menacing growl. "Let me give you a piece of free advice," Tanner said, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and something sour. "This building, this whole area, it's not for you." He gestured vaguely with his head at the gleaming towers that pierced the night sky. "This is a high-class place. We keep it that way. You'd be smarter not to come back. Things can get complicated for people who don't belong." Marcus Coleman stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of the streetlights. He met the officer's hostile gaze without flinching. "Is that a threat, officer?" he asked, his voice quiet but losing none of its precision. The question was not an accusation. It was a clinical inquiry, a request for clarification. Tanner's eyes, hard as stone, narrowed into slits. "It's a warning," he countered, the words scraping from his throat. "I'm warning you that next time you're caught trespassing, it won't be a friendly escort out the door. We'll find something that sticks, a resisting charge, maybe disorderly conduct. We always do." It was a naked admission of the system's weaponization, a boast about the ease with which a narrative could be fabricated and a life ruined. Marcus simply held his gaze for another 2 seconds, his mind a steel trap, a high-fidelity recording device capturing every detail, the exact phrasing of the threat, the aggressive posture, the implicit promise of manufactured charges, the names and badge numbers he had already committed to memory. This was no longer just an encounter, it was evidence. The officers turned and swaggered back to their patrol car, their laughter echoing briefly in the quiet street before the slam of car doors cut it off. As the vehicle's taillights disappeared around the corner, a switch flipped inside Marcus Coleman. The passive, compliant subject was gone. The special agent in charge was back in command. Before his hand even touched the handle of his own unmarked sedan parked across the street, his phone was out, his thumb already dialing a number he knew by heart. The call connected on the first ring. The voice that answered was sharp, clipped, and radiated an authority that even a compressed cellular signal could not diminish. "Lawson?" "Sir, it's Coleman," Marcus said, his voice a low murmur as he slid into the cool leather of the driver's seat. The sanitized interior of the government-issue vehicle was his true office, a space of controlled, focused purpose. It happened again, just like we predicted. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line, the sound of a man burdened by the weight of a problem he knew all too well. "Chicago?" Director Robert Lawson asked. There was no surprise in his voice, only a deep, weary resignation that quickly hardened into a core of cold anger. "Give me the basics." "Local PD, responding to a security guard's suspicious person. Call at the Target building," Marcus recounted, his words flowing with the dispassionate clarity of a field report. "Subject was me. Escalation was by the book, their book. Public search. Seizure of professional notes. The whole package. The encounter concluded with veiled threats of fabricated charges if I returned to the area." "And the operation?" Lawson's voice was sharp, cutting to the most critical tactical concern. "Is the financial investigation compromised?" "Negative, sir," Marcus confirmed. "I never identified. As far as Officer Tanner and his team are concerned, they just successfully intimidated a random black man who was, in their minds, far out of his league. The primary investigation is completely secure." "Good," Lawson said, a hint of relief in his tone. Then it hardened again, shifting from tactical to strategic. "So we activate the secondary protocol?" "That's my recommendation, sir," Marcus replied, his gaze fixed on the gleaming facade of the Atlas Tower, a monument to the very corruption he was there to dismantle. "This is a perfect test case. The security guard, Barrett, has a documented history of this behavior. My team's preliminary research flagged him for making 17 similar calls in the past 2 years, all targeting minorities. And the lead officer, Tanner, he felt comfortable. Too comfortable. This isn't his first time exercising this particular brand of authority. He felt comfortable because the system has always protected him," Lawson said, his voice grim. "He believes he's immune. He believes his badge gives him the right to be judge, jury, and enforcer based on the color of a man's skin." "Yep, sir," Marcus said, a cold edge creeping into his own voice. "And tomorrow, we're going to introduce him to a higher authority." Marcus Coleman ended the call and opened a secure application on his phone, its interface a stark, utilitarian black and gray. This was the direct portal to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, a specialized tool designed for documenting incidents of official misconduct. With meticulous precision, he began to dictate his report. His eidetic memory replayed the entire encounter, and he translated it into cold, hard data. Timestamps were logged to the second. Names and badge numbers were entered without error. Direct quotes from Barrett and Tanner were transcribed verbatim. He included his tactical assessment of the officers' positions, his professional opinion on their procedural errors, and a detailed description of their nonverbal cues. As he finished the final sentence of the report and tapped the submit button, sending the encrypted package of evidence into the heart of the federal justice system, he allowed a singly controlled flicker of his own cold anger to surface in the silent privacy of his car. He had endured the humiliation, swallowed the insults, and weathered the threats. He had played the part of the victim flawlessly, all for the sake of the mission. And now the second, more important mission was about to begin. Dawn broke over the city, casting long, sharp shadows from the skyscrapers. And as the first rays of sunlight struck the gleaming glass of the Atlas Financial Tower, a fleet of dark, unmarked vehicles converged on its location with silent, coordinated precision. At precisely 0900 hours, the doors to those vehicles opened in unison, and a team of federal agents emerged, their movements economical and imbued with a palpable sense of purpose. The next morning, Marcus Coleman returned to the Atlas building, and he did not come alone. Now openly wearing a Navy FBI windbreaker with bold yellow lettering, his federal credentials hanging from a lanyard around his neck, he led a tactical team of 12 agents through the same revolving doors he had been thrown out of less than 14 hours earlier. He was not a solitary, ambiguous figure to be judged and dismissed. He was the tip of a spear. Behind him, the 12 FBI agents fanned out in a fluid, synchronized movement the moment they cleared the entrance, securing the lobby with a quiet efficiency that was infinitely more intimidating than the loud aggression of the previous night. They wore black tactical vests over their professional attire, each vest emblazoned with the same 3 bold yellow letters, FBI, on the front and back. Marcus's entire demeanor had transformed. The quiet, observant confidence of the undercover agent was gone, replaced by the unmistakable aura of indisputable command. His posture was straighter, his gaze more direct, his every movement a testament to his rank and the full weight of the federal government that stood behind him. The golden shield hanging against his chest was no longer a hidden fact to be ignored, but a gleaming focal point of absolute authority. Inside the cramped security office, Kevin Barrett was enjoying the last moment of peace he would know for a very long time. He was taking a triumphant sip of his morning coffee, a self-satisfied smirk on his face as he replayed the previous night's events in his mind. He had done his job. He had neutralized a threat. He had kept his building safe. Then, he glanced up at the main lobby monitor, and his world shattered. His coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth, hot liquid sloshing over his hand, though he barely felt the burn. It was the same man, the same shaved head, the same strong features, the same tailored suit, now visible under an open federal jacket. A wave of ice-cold dread, so intense it was physically nauseating, washed over him. His mind reeled, refusing to process the impossible image on the screen. His hand, shaking so violently that he could barely control it, fumbled for his phone, dropping it once before snatching it up. He didn't call dispatch. He called Rick Tanner's personal cell phone. "He's back," Barrett stammered into the phone, his voice a choked, panicked whisper. "The guy from last night, he's back, and he's got a whole damn army with him. They're wearing FBI jackets. Rick, FBI." Marcus ignored the young, terrified-looking guard at the main desk, who seemed frozen in place. His team held their positions, a silent, powerful tableau of federal power that had brought the lobby's morning rhythm to a dead halt. He waited, his expression impassive, until the door to the security office burst open. Kevin Barrett stumbled out, his uniform already rumpled, his face pale and slick with a sheen of cold sweat. "Agent," he began, his voice cracking, the word a desperate plea. "Sir, I didn't realize. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Marcus finally turned his head and looked at Barrett. He didn't look at him with anger or even with satisfaction. He looked at him with the cold, clinical disinterest of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope, something to be analyzed, documented, and dissected. "There has been no misunderstanding, Mr. Barrett," Marcus said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the tense silence of the lobby like a surgeon's scalpel. "You made an assessment based on your professional experience. You identified what you believed to be a threat. You acted on it, and now, so am I." With that, the power dynamic of the entire building, so rigidly enforced the night before, was not just reversed, it was annihilated. Marcus Coleman's team systematically took control, rendering Kevin Barrett's authority utterly and irrevocably meaningless. The agent turned to his second-in-command, a sharp, focused agent named Carlos Rivera. "Agent Rivera, you and your team will secure the 14th and 15th floors. I want every piece of paper, every hard drive, every server. Jackson, Williams, you're on the server room in the sub-basement. No electronic communication leaves this building. Go. Cucky. The teams moved out with a breathtaking speed and precision that spoke of endless hours of training. They flowed through the lobby and toward the elevators, their movements a stark contrast to the clumsy, brutish actions of the local police. Barrett watched, helpless, as the institution he thought he served was rendered powerless. But the warrants. Do you have warrants? He asked, his voice a desperate, pleading squeak. Marcus held up a thick, leather-bound folder. We have warrants, Mr. Barrett. Duly signed federal warrants authorizing a full search and seizure of every office and electronic device associated with Arthur Westfield's financial operations. He paused, letting the weight of his next words land with the force of a physical blow. And thanks to your actions last night and the detailed report I filed, we now have a separate federal warrant for all security logs, all surveillance footage, and all communication records for this entire building for the past 48 hours. You, yourself, provided the probable cause for that one? Just as a helpless, utterly broken. Barrett turned to comply with an agent's firm directive. The main elevator doors chimed, their soft, pleasant sound a surreal counterpoint to the unfolding drama. Arthur Westfield, the primary target of the entire financial investigation, the man who believed himself to be an untouchable titan of industry, strode into the lobby. He was in the middle of an animated phone call, a confident, predatory smile on his face as he barked orders to some underling. The smile froze as he took in the scene. His world, once a predictable universe of numbers, influence, and unwavering authority, had suddenly tilted on its axis. And the man standing calmly at the epicenter of this earthquake was the very individual his system had identified as insignificant. For a moment, Arthur Westfield's brain refused to process the scene. The lobby of his building, his fortress, a space he controlled as absolutely as a king controlled his throne room, was swarming with federal agents. They moved with a quiet, unnerving purpose, their presence a violation of the natural order he had spent a lifetime constructing. The shock quickly curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. What is the meaning of this? Westfield boomed, his voice a practiced instrument of intimidation, accustomed to making underlings tremble, echoed across the marble. He took a half step forward, his posture a mixture of indignation and disbelief. This is an invasion. I will have every one of your badges for this. Oh, Marcus Coleman, who had been observing the magnate's reaction with a calm, analytical eye, began to walk toward him. His steps were measured and unhurried, the gait of a man who held all the cards and knew it. He stopped a respectful but non-negotiable distance away from the fuming executive. Mr. Westfield, he began, his voice devoid of any emotion, save a chilling professionalism. I am Special Agent in Charge Marcus Coleman, FBI Financial Crimes Division. He extended a thick, leather-bound folder containing a copy of the warrant. This document, signed by a federal judge less than 2 hours ago, authorizes my team to conduct a full search and seizure operation related to an ongoing investigation into securities fraud, money laundering, and racketeering within your companies. Westfield Holdings, Atlas Investment Partners, and Meridian Trust. Westfield stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake, refusing to take it. The specific mention of all three of his primary companies sent a jolt of real fear through his outrage. This wasn't a fishing expedition. They knew, in that moment, Marcus Coleman masterfully and with a cold, public precision began to weave together the two seemingly separate threads of his investigation. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the sweating-as terrified form of Kevin Barrett, who was trying to make himself invisible near the security desk. The harassment allegations, however, are being handled by a different division. Mr. Westfield, Marcus said, his tone deceptively mild. He then looked directly at the security guard. Isn't that right, Mr. Barrett? You were just telling me all about your impeccable security protocols last night before your officers escorted me out. The public connection was a tactical masterstroke. Barrett looked as if he was about to faint, his face a sickly shade of gray. He looked from Marcus to his ultimate employer, his mouth opening and closing silently for a moment before any sound came out. Mr. Westfield, I'm sorry, sir. This is the man from the incident, the one I told you about. Westfield's eyes widened, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He saw the trap. He immediately tried to sever the connection, to jettison the man who had brought this plague upon his house. I have no knowledge of any incident, Westfield snapped, his voice sharp with dismissive contempt. Mr. Barrett operates security independently. His actions are his own. Interesting, Marcus said, the single word hanging in the air. Because phone records, which are now in federal possession, show that he placed a call directly to your personal cell phone at 7:43 p.m. last night, immediately after I was escorted from the premises. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He paused, letting the damning specificity of the details sink in. Would you care to elaborate on that independent security matter for the record, Mr. Westfield? Before the stunned executive could formulate a response, the main lobby doors swished open again. Officer Rick Tanner strode in, his uniform hastily assembled, a look of impatient confusion on his face. He had come in response to Barrett's panicked, incoherent call, expecting to find some minor issue. He froze at the entrance, his brain short-circuiting as he saw the lobby teeming with FBI agents. His gaze swept the room and finally landed on Marcus Coleman, the man he had threatened and humiliated less than 12 hours earlier, who was now standing at the absolute center of the storm, directing it. The bravado and swagger from the previous night evaporated in an instant, replaced by a dawning, sickening sense of professional and personal dread. Tanner approached the group cautiously, his face a mask of strained neutrality. Sir, Agent, he stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. We were just responding to a suspicious person call last night. Standard procedure. Of course, Officer Tanner, Marcus said, turning to face him with a chilling politeness that was more menacing than any shout. Just as it is now standard procedure for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate credible allegations of civil rights violations committed under the color of law, he let the legally potent phrase hang in the air for a moment. Your body camera footage from last night should be very illuminating in that regard. The words civil rights violations and body camera footage landed like physical blows. Tanner's professional mask crumbled, his face paling. He looked from Marcus to Westfield to Barrett, finally understanding that he was not an officer of the law arriving at a scene, but a suspect caught in the same inescapable net as the others. At that moment, the FBI Civil Rights Division officially authorized the concurrent investigation, and agents already on site began the process of securing all relevant evidence. A young female officer, one of the three who had been on the scene with Tanner the previous night, stepped forward from the periphery. She had stood in the background then, her discomfort visible, and had clearly wrestled with her conscience all night. Agent Coleman, she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the tense atmosphere. I was present last night. I was not the primary officer, but I would like to provide a full and formal statement about what I observed. Marcus looked at her, and for the first time, a hint of something other than cold professionalism entered his expression. It was a glimmer of profound respect. Thank you, officer, he said, his tone acknowledging the courage of her action. We will take your formal testimony. Your cooperation is noted. With the final piece in place, and Marcus Coleman explained the terrifying new investigative angle that now bound all three men together. To be clear, gentlemen, he said, your financial crimes and Mr. Barrett's discriminatory practices will now be treated as potentially connected investigations. The possibility that a discriminatory security environment was deliberately fostered here to deflect or deter legitimate scrutiny from your financial operations is now an active and primary investigative angle. He turned his attention back to the trio of Westfield, Barrett, and Tanner. who were now exchanging panicked, desperate glances, each man finally understanding the full, catastrophic scope of the situation. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, the word dripping with a final, chilling irony, "it appears our investigation has just expanded. I believe you'll all want to call your lawyers immediately." As the three men scrambled to contact their legal counsel, a sense of irreversible momentum filled the lobby. The gears of federal justice, once set in motion, now began to turn with a relentless and crushing force. The consequences they had unknowingly triggered the night before arrived not like a single, crashing tidal wave, but like a series of precise, devastating demolition charges, each one detonating in sequence, bringing a different part of their corrupt and complacent worlds crashing down. The first charge detonated deep within the financial heart of the Atlas Tower. While field agents were still cataloging physical evidence, the FBI's Forensic Accounting Division, a team of quiet, relentless professionals who could find a lie hidden in a 10-year-old spreadsheet, descended upon Arthur Westfield's digital empire. Working from a secure off-site command center, they began to peel back the layers of his operation. What they found was a labyrinth of deception far more intricate and audacious than their initial intelligence had suggested. The fraud was not limited to a few falsified returns or inflated asset reports. It was the very foundation of his business. They uncovered a sophisticated network of offshore shell corporations, ghost employees on the payroll, and investor funds being systematically siphoned into untraceable accounts in the Cayman Islands. The initial estimate of $47 million in investor fraud quickly became obsolete. As new victims were identified and more hidden accounts were unearthed, the number ballooned, first to 60, then to 65, finally settling at a staggering $68 million. The second charge targeted Kevin Barrett. On day 3 of the investigation, he was summoned to the corporate headquarters of the property management company. He sat in a sterile, windowless HR office, the air smelling faintly of ozone and corporate anxiety. Across a polished desk, a grim-faced senior executive, a man Barrett had never met, slid a single white envelope toward him. "This is a formal notification of your administrative leave, effective immediately," the executive said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Barrett's left shoulder, refusing to make contact. Barrett's hands, resting on his knees, trembled. "Administrative leave? A review? I was doing my job," he insisted, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and indignation. "I was protecting the tenants. I identified a threat." The executive's eyes finally snapped into focus, and they were as cold and hard as chips of ice. "You harassed a senior federal agent while he was conducting a multi-million-dollar investigation." "Kevin," the man said, his voice dropping to a low, cutting whisper, "you triggered a massive and very public federal civil rights investigation into this company. Your gut feeling has brought the full weight of the Department of Justice down on our heads. You didn't do your job. You exposed this company to millions of dollars in catastrophic liability. You're a problem we have to solve." The third charge detonated within the Chicago Police Department, the internal affairs investigation into Rick Tanner, spurred by the damning testimony of the female officer and corroborated by 2 other junior officers who now felt emboldened to come forward, was swift and brutal. They pulled his records, and with the new intense scrutiny of federal oversight looming, they saw the pattern they had previously chosen to ignore: a long history of civilian complaints, disproportionately from minority individuals, all summarily dismissed. His own body camera footage, an archive of his professional conduct, became his accuser. Tanner sat across from his union representative in a dimly lit, smoky backroom of a bar near the precinct. "They're trying to railroad me," he insisted, his voice a low, angry growl. "I made a judgment call based on a credible report from building security. It was a textbook stop." The rep, a portly, cynical man with tired eyes, took a long drag from his cigarette and sighed, the smoke curling around his head like a shroud. "Rick, the optics are terrible," the rep said, his voice gravelly. "The guy is a decorated FBI agent leading a massive fraud bust. The female officer is on the record testifying that you deliberately ignored his federal ID. Your own body cam audio has you threatening him with fabricated charges. What in God's name did you expect? I expected the department to have my back, Tanner shot back, slamming his fist on the table. I'm one of them. The blue wall. The rep gave a bitter, humorless laugh. The wall protects the precinct. Rick, not every brick in it. And right now, you're a brick that's threatening the whole structure. The brass is terrified of a federal consent decree. They need to show Washington they're taking it seriously, and that means offering up a head on a platter. He leaned forward, crushing his cigarette into an overflowing ashtray. They have their own back, the rep said grimly, and right now, you're the limb they need to amputate to save the body. You're not a cop anymore. Rick, you're the sacrificial lamb. Arthur Westfield, meanwhile, discovered that the currency of his world, influence, had been rendered worthless overnight. Accustomed to solving any problem with a few discreet phone calls to the powerful men he cultivated, he now found those lines going dead. He sat in his lawyer's opulent office, a grand space with sweeping city views that suddenly felt like the most luxurious cage in the world. They're not taking my call, Westfield fumed, pacing back and forth on the plush oriental rug. My call to Congressman Albright went straight to his chief of staff, who said the congressman was unavailable. And Judge Miller, a man I have golfed with for a decade, had his clerk tell me it would be inappropriate for him to discuss the matter. They're cutting me loose. His lawyer, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to state the grimly obvious, nodded. Arthur, you're radioactive, he said, steepling his fingers. This isn't just about the financial fraud anymore. That we could manage, we could delay, negotiate, cut a deal. But they have inextricably tied you to a high-profile racial profiling case. In this political climate, no politician, no judge, no one will touch you. You've become a pariah. Within a week, the individual threads of their unraveling were woven together by the relentless 24-hour news cycle. The dual investigation became a national news story, a compelling narrative that was more than just another tale of corporate greed. It was a story about the toxic intersection of wealth, power, and systemic racism, with a decorated black FBI agent at its center. The media focused on both the staggering $68 million financial fraud and the chilling, undeniable civil rights aspect, turning the Atlas Tower into a symbol of a rot that ran deeper than just the money. With the court of public opinion already rendering its verdict, the formal process of legal accountability began, moving from the chaotic realm of news headlines into the cold, methodical theater of the American justice system. The federal courtroom designated for the trial of United States v. Westfield was a theater of quiet, immense power, a grand space of polished mahogany wood, hushed tones, and the solemn weight of the American flag standing beside the judge's bench. Arthur Westfield, stripped of his entourage and his aura of invincibility, sat at the defense table, his expensive suit now looking less like a symbol of success and more like a costume for a man playing a role he no longer understood and could not escape. When Marcus Coleman took the stand, a profound stillness fell over the room. He projected an aura of unshakable confidence, not of arrogance, but of a man armed with an arsenal of irrefutable facts. Under direct examination by the assistant U.S. attorney, his testimony was a masterclass in clarity and precision, with the aid of complex flowcharts and highlighted financial statements displayed on large monitors for the jury. He laid out the intricate architecture of Arthur Westfield's $68 million Ponzi scheme. He spoke of falsified returns, manipulated financial statements, and a sophisticated network of shell corporations designed for the sole purpose of deliberate misrepresentation to investors. His language was technical, dispassionate, and utterly devastating. During the cross-examination, Westfield's lead defense attorney, a famously aggressive litigator named Benjamin Shaw, tried to find a crack in the agent's formidable composure. "Agent Coleman," Shaw began, his voice smooth and condescending, "is it not true that you had a rather unpleasant, and shall we say, personal encounter with the security staff of the Atlas Tower on the very night before you led this raid? I had an encounter that is now the subject of a separate and ongoing federal civil rights investigation. Marcus corrected him coolly, his voice even. I would not characterize it as unpleasant. I would characterize it as evidentiary. The distinction was subtle but powerful, reframing the narrative from one of personal grievance to one of professional evidence collection. Shaw pressed on, circling his prey. And you expect this jury to believe that your personal feelings from that encounter, your anger, your humiliation, as was widely reported, did not in any way color your judgment or motivate your actions during the investigation of my client the following day? Marcus met the lawyer's gaze, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. My judgment is based on evidence, counselor, and the evidence, which my team and I gathered over a period of 3 months prior to the incident you're referring to, shows that Mr. Westfield's company systematically defrauded over 200 investors. He paused, letting his next words land with deliberate weight. The evidence gathered during the incident, however, shows that Mr. Westfield benefited from a discriminatory security environment designed to deter and humiliate legitimate visitors, thereby reducing the likelihood of any real scrutiny of his operations, especially from people who, in his security chief's own words, didn't belong. The only feeling I have, counselor, is a professional commitment to exposing both criminal enterprises. Across town, in a much less grand, fluorescent-lit administrative hearing room, Officer Rick Tanner's career was officially ending. He faced an internal review board of 3 high-ranking police officials. The female officer who had broken the blue wall of silence to come forward provided damning testimony, her voice steady and clear as she recounted not just the incident with Agent Coleman, but a pattern of discriminatory enforcement she had witnessed for years. It wasn't just the aggressive tone he used, she explained, her gaze fixed on the board members, refusing to look at her former colleague. It was the choices he made. He deliberately chose to escalate a non-threatening situation. He deliberately chose to ignore federal credentials that were in plain sight. He deliberately chose to stage a public search in the lobby to maximize humiliation. She took a deep breath. These were not the actions of an officer following procedure. These were the actions of a bully using his badge as a weapon. The board chairman, a veteran deputy chief with a face like carved granite, turned to a sullen, resentful Tanner. Officer Tanner, your own body camera footage shows the subject, who we now know to be Special Agent in Charge Coleman, remained calm and compliant at all times. Yet you unsnapped your holster and, by your own admission, prepared to draw your weapon. Can you please explain to this board the specific, articulable threat that justified that level of escalation? Tanner, his usual bluster long gone, stammered, his eyes darting around the room. It was the totality of the circumstances, he mumbled, falling back on the oldest, weakest excuse in the book. The call from security, his vagueness, the restricted floor, the totality of the circumstances. Officer, seems to be that he was a black man in a place you didn't think he should be, the chairman said, his voice cold and devoid of sympathy. That's not a circumstance. That's a prejudice, and it has no place in this department. In yet another government building, Kevin Barrett faced a federal investigator from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, charged with discriminatory practices in his role as a security chief. His attempts to justify his actions crumbled under the weight of cold, hard data. He was confronted with the building security logs and his own call records, which showed a stark, undeniable statistical bias. Mr. Barrett, can you explain why, in a building with thousands of visitors a month from all backgrounds, you only felt the need to call the police on 17 separate occasions, and all 17 of those individuals were people of color? The investigator asked, her tone even and methodical. I told you it was instinct, professional experience, Barrett insisted, his voice growing shrill, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. I approach people who look suspicious. And by what criteria, exactly, did you determine who looked suspicious? The investigator pressed, Barrett's explanation dissolved into a series of vague, circular references to his own professional intuition and behavior patterns he could not specifically identify or describe. The investigator slid a glossy A8810 photograph across the table. It was a high-resolution still from the security footage, time-stamped just 10 minutes before Marcus Coleman had arrived on the night of the incident. The photo clearly showed a young white man in a stained hoodie, ripped jeans, and a backwards baseball cap walking past the security desk unchallenged, not even receiving a glance from Barrett. "Did your professional instinct tell you anything about this individual, Mr. Barrett?" she asked quietly. Barrett stared at the photo, at the undeniable visual proof of his own selective criteria. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. There was nothing left to say. His instinct stood exposed for what it was, a simple, ugly prejudice. Finally, in a separate federal hearing addressing the civil rights violations, Marcus Coleman was called to give his concluding testimony. He stood not merely as the lead investigator on a financial case, but as the primary victim and expert witness in a case about the abuse of power. His testimony silenced the courtroom, his words framing the entire saga in its proper systemic context. This case, he explained, wasn't about one unpleasant incident or one individual's bad day. It documented a corrosive pattern where appearance determined access, where bias masqueraded as security, and where, most insidiously, discrimination was allowed to flourish because it created a protective shield for far greater financial crimes. It was a powerful testament that defined the case not as an isolated event, but as a symptom of a deep, systemic disease. Coleman's powerful final testimony shifted the focus from individual guilt to institutional failure, creating a mandate for change that would resonate far beyond the courtroom and become the catalyst for a wave of unprecedented, systemic reforms. The verdict against Arthur Westfield was swift and decisive, resulting in a sentence that ensured the fallen titan would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But Marcus Coleman knew that locking up one corrupt executive was like pulling a single, prominent weed from an infested field. The real, lasting work was in salting the earth so nothing like it could ever grow again. In an extraordinary move, the federal judge presiding over the civil rights portion of the case adopted Marcus Coleman's recommendation for systemic remedies, not just individual penalties. The ruling acknowledged that the actions of Tanner and Barrett were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a deeper institutional rot. This legal precedent became the foundation for all the changes that followed, creating a powerful mandate that could not be ignored. The Chicago Police Department, facing the humiliating prospect of being placed under complete federal receivership, had no choice but to enter into a comprehensive consent decree with the Department of Justice. This was not a superficial agreement for a few new training modules. It was a root and branch restructuring of their entire philosophy of policing. The decree mandated proactive monitoring of all officer-civilian interactions, with advanced data analysis to flag officers who showed statistical bias in their stops. It required a complete overhaul of their use of force policies and, most importantly, their training academy curriculum. At one of the first of these new, mandatory training sessions, the female officer who had courageously testified against Tanner, now a newly promoted sergeant, stood before a hostile room of veteran cops. Her presence alone was a statement, but her words were a revolution. "For years," she began, her voice ringing with an authority that was earned, not just conferred. "We've operated on a principle of reasonable suspicion, but somewhere along the line, we've allowed that legal term to become a convenient cover for personal bias. We see someone who looks out of place according to our own narrow worldview, and we use that feeling as justification to act. That ends today." She clicked a remote, and two images filled the large screen behind her. Marcus Coleman in his immaculate tailored suit, and the security still of the young white man in the stained hoodie and ripped jeans. The man on the left was a decorated senior FBI agent conducting a multi-million-dollar federal investigation, she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. The man on the right was a college student delivering a package for his part-time job. One was treated as a potential felon, publicly humiliated, and threatened. The other was completely invisible. The only significant, observable difference between them was the color of their skin. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the stony faces in the room. "We failed." A veteran officer in the back grumbled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "So what are we supposed to do? Just let everyone walk?" The sergeant's eyes snapped to him, her focus sharp and unwavering. "No," she shot back, her voice like steel. "You are supposed to do your job, and your job is to base your actions on observable, specific, and articulable behavior, not on lazy and bigoted stereotypes. From this point forward, if you can't articulate the why of a stop without resorting to how a person looks, you don't make the stop. It is that simple." The reforms rippled out with surprising speed into the private sector. The Atlas Buildings Management Company, desperate to rehabilitate its tarnished brand, adopted a radical new set of security protocols. These new standards, which began to be known in industry circles as the Coleman Doctrine, completely abandoned subjective instinct in favor of objective behavioral indicators. Insurance companies, driven by cold, hard data, were the unexpected accelerants of this change. Their risk assessment models showed that biased, aggressive security practices like Kevin Barrett's didn't reduce liability. They actively created it. They began offering significant premium reductions to commercial properties that achieved certification in the new, bias-aware protocols. Suddenly, it was profitable to be fair. Inspired by the case's success, the FBI itself underwent an evolution. Director Robert Lawson, using the national attention from the Atlas investigation as leverage, secured congressional funding to establish a permanent civil rights compliance unit. Its sole purpose was to proactively analyze data from law enforcement agencies and private sector partners to identify and investigate systemic patterns of discrimination, rather than just reacting to individual, high-profile incidents after the damage was done. The most significant change was procedural. Marcus Coleman's dual investigation approach, the strategy of examining if civil rights violations were being used as a shield for other criminal activities, became standard protocol in complex federal cases, leading to a documented 43% increase successful prosecutions in its first year by exposing the protective ecosystems that allowed organized crime to flourish. With the new protocols taking root and the data validating their success, the story transitions from the noisy, disruptive work of reform to the quiet, lasting peace of a system beginning to heal itself. 6 months later, Marcus Coleman stood before a graduating class at the FBI Academy. He wore a simple dark suit, but he commanded the attention of the auditorium with an authority that was quiet, earned, and absolute. The young, eager faces of the new agents were fixed on him, recognizing him not just as a special agent in charge, but as the architect of a paradigm shift in federal law enforcement. "We are taught to hunt for monsters," he told them, his voice calm and resonant, filling the space without any need for force. "The fraudster, the terrorist, the killer. But the most dangerous monster is often the system that allows the others to thrive." The Atlas investigation was never just about one corrupt executive. It was about the ecosystem of bias and complacency that protected him. "We must learn to see and fight the ecosystem, not just the monster it produces." His words carried the weight of experience, a lesson that resonated far beyond the training manuals. It was this commitment to a deeper form of justice that led Marcus Coleman to decline a prestigious promotion to a high-level administrative position at FBI headquarters. Director Robert Lawson had called him into his office personally. The Washington, D.C. skyline visible through the panoramic window behind him. "Marcus, you've earned it," Lawson had said, gesturing to a chart of the new departmental structure. "This is a policy-level job. You could shape the entire bureau for the next decade." "With all due respect, sir," Marcus had replied, his gaze steady, "the policies are only as good as the agents who execute them. My place is in the field, training the next generation how to see the entire board, not just the next move. Lawson had nodded, a look of profound understanding on his face. All right, Coleman, stay in the field, but you're going to be my personal advisor on the new compliance units. You started this. You're going to help me see it through. True to his word, Coleman became a key voice for reform, a respected and sought-after speaker at industry conferences and congressional committees, always emphasizing the undeniable link between fair enforcement and overall operational effectiveness. The institutional changes he catalyzed produced measurable, undeniable progress. Data from cities that adopted the new protocols showed a significant decrease in discriminatory incidents, a corresponding drop in civilian complaints against police, and, most tellingly, an improvement in crime detection rates as community trust was slowly rebuilt. But the true and profound impact of the Atlas case was portrayed as invisible. It was written in the quiet non-events, the confrontations that no longer happened, the careers that were no longer impeded by the silent weight of bias, the immense talent that was no longer lost to a system that unfairly barred the door. Progress, Marcus knew, was not always measured in headlines or convictions. It was often measured in silence, the quiet, unremarkable, everyday experience of true equality. It's the understanding that justice isn't just about punishment for a past transgression, but about building a better, fairer future for all. It is the core principle that accountability works best when it transforms rather than merely punishes. It's a powerful lesson, and we are so grateful you joined us to witness it. If this story of strategic justice resonated with you, please help it reach others by sharing it, and be sure to follow for more stories like this. Thank you for your time. We'll see you in the next one.